So, one of the things that I did this past season to keep up with my understanding of Fire Country was that I read reviews posted by TV Fanatic. I don't agree with most of their takes in general, and I think a lot of the points are wrong. But that's what made it such a good exercise for me. I couldn't just point and say, that's wrong. I wanted to understand where that opinion derived from and why I thought it was wrong. Something that I heard over and over again misused was this term trope. Almost certainly they intended to say tired trope, but it reminded me that this is a term that way too many people use without actually knowing its meaning. Well, I like to claim that I started making video essays all the way back in the Brony area, which had a whole bunch of video essays back in the day. I really only did some very minor things back then. I started to understand analysis in the way that I could put all of this together when I started reading the fan site TV Tropes. What you learn when you study literature, and what I learned through reading TV tropes, is that all fiction is really made of building blocks. If you remember my dad's comments about there only being really 7 different stories, this is along the same lines. There are lots of different parts or pieces to stories and characters. Each new universe or story is just a combination of these tropes played out in different ways. So, idiot hero runs in and somehow it works is a trope. It's just a thing that happens in the stories. But when people say tired trope, what they usually mean is a trope that's being reused without much variation, and we can debate what falls into that. Admittedly, you are probably not here to learn about how I learned analysis, but because you've noticed the onslaught of Fire Country and Has Been Hotel edits, and you're like, what the heck? Why? The short answer is that both universes contain a lot of tropes, and I've been entertaining my mom with humor from them. But for now, after 3 or 4 such videos, I thought it would be fair to actually break down what this sharing of tropes can look like. But I'm gonna do this with Has Been Hotel's sister show, Hell of a Boss. But if we've learned anything about analysis this last year, you know that I need to talk about the Helliverse before I can talk about the trope of this video, which is abuse remaining hidden in plain sight. Though I think TV Tropes calls it inverted abuse mistake. Has Been Hotel follows Charlie Morningstar, the daughter of Lucifer, as she tries to create a way to get sinners from hell into heaven. The show itself has a theology that mixes canonical religious texts from the 3 Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as well as a variety of non-canonical texts such as the Lesser Key of Solomon, Dante's Inferno, and various Jewish folklore that includes the character of Lilith. As a result, you have Adam being the first man, Abel being his son, and seraphim angels having 3 pairs of wings, alongside goetic demons, circles of hell, and Adam having a first wife before Eve. Because of the nature of the universe, and most of the main and secondary characters residing in hell, the majority of both Has Been and Helliva take place in what's supposed to be biblical hell, though this world conditions getting into heaven on something to do with goodness, probably, and not salvation like Christianity. In this world, angels come down and kill sinners out of fear that hell will one day rise up against heaven, and Charlie hopes that her hotel will cause the angels to stop these exterminations. While Fire Country is pretty loudly a show that doesn't have much to do with religion, with Jake being the only religious person on the main cast, I still find Has Been shares a lot of themes with Fire Country. Overall, both shows are about redemption and what it actually means. As an example, in both shows, the person being redeemed has to actually make the choice to be part of redeeming. In Fire Country, the inmates have to apply to become part of the con camp system, and in Has Been, people have to decide to stay at the hotel, as well as to participate in the therapy groups to work on redeeming themselves for their sins. Even aside from the big, broad themes, there are a lot of little things that are similar as well. For an example, Adam and Luth's general belief that sinners are irredeemable is very similar to what Alec and maybe Eva believe about the growers. In addition, while I know I recently made a video where Mickey stood in for Charlie with her belief that redemption might be possible, Mickey yanking that belief away as soon as Wes gets arrested reminds me very heavily of what happens with Sarah when they go down to apologize to Hell for the exterminations, and she discovers that Vox is plotting to take over heaven with the help of the sinners. But while there are a multitude of characters, relationships, plot devices, and themes that I could compare and contrast between these two properties, for purposes of this video, I picked one that's near and dear to my heart. While you know that abuse is really the backbone of this channel, no one seems to want to talk about it in Fire Country, and yet it's what really endured me to the property. Just like Fire Country has Sheriff Country, Has-Been Hotel has Hell of a Boss, and it's actually time that I talk about the character in Hell of a Boss that I want to analyze in this video. While Has-Been is primarily concerned with sinners and fallen angels, people who have not always resided in hell, the sister show Hell of a Boss takes place primarily with creatures that have always lived in hell, known in universe as Hellborns. All of the Hellborns, what we would usually call demons, were created to serve a purpose. The 7 deadly sins were created to rule over the 7 rings of hell. The goetic demons serve other governing purposes. There are also other different demon species which serve either sinners or other Hellborns in some manner. While the ruling class sits above the sinners socially, all of the other Hellborns sit below in a caste system, creating a world where the Galusha are not really supposed to form relationships outside of other members of the royal family. There's a lot more that I could get into, but for this video, I wanted to talk about one specific trope that's used in both the Edgewaterverse and the Helliverse, and that's this idea of abuse that hides in plain sight. Both properties do something that feels unique. They portray abusive relationships where only really the abuser, the victim, and the audience can see everything that's going on. As a way of highlighting this feature, they also show a child who has no idea and frequently participates in victim blaming that they don't even realize because of how the abuser has warped the victim in the mind of the child involved. I know that's a very specific trope, but I'm talking about 2 very specific relationships here. On Helliva, I'm talking about the abusive marriage of Stolas and Stella, with the bystander child being their 17-year-old daughter Octavia. On Fire Country, I'm talking about the child abuse that never ended, that Walter inflicts on his oldest son Vince, that Bodhi seems completely unaware of. Before I talk about the abuse side of this, I should probably talk about Stolas. Ordinarily, in a video comparing 2 characters and 2 different properties, I would introduce you to Vince as well, but I literally made 2 videos about the guy that you can check out on my channel, as well as the Walter video and like half of the Bodhi video. That being said, I am going to be going over additional points that I haven't talked about in any video yet. Stolas is one of the 5 main characters of Hell of a Boss, and the only character not in the lowest social class of Hell. He's a goetic prince, which seemingly makes him one of the higher ranking Goetia. In the Season 2 opener, The Circus, we learned that on a specific birthday, young Goetia are told what their role is to serve Hell. Stolas is placed in charge of the stars and the prophecies they hold, and he'll do that with the help of a grimoire. He also learns that he is engaged to another Goetia named Stella because the Goetia needed a precautionary heir. This despite being gay and maybe having a crush on Blitz, who he met when they were children. Long story short, 25 years later, Blitz decides to break into Stolas' house to steal the grimoire and use it in his assassination business that goes to Earth. Stolas misinterprets this as an attempt to have an affair, and Blitz ends up having sex with him, seemingly because he felt bad that he tied him up. Later, Stolas makes regular sex sessions a condition of keeping the grimoire until the middle of Season 2. Or maybe the beginning of Season 2 if you look at these texts. But anyway, on that first night, Blitz spends the night with Stolas and then, for some reason, runs out with the book in his hand, crashes directly into Stella and her friends eating. This makes perfect sense for a show about a boss who's a doofus. That gay demon love affair is not the subject of today's video. Stolas' other main plot in the series is that he's a victim of domestic abuse. If you've seen any number of my videos, you'll know that abuse is a very important topic on this channel. That Walter video is 45 minutes of me systematically proving that Walter did not abuse Vince in the past. It was something going on until the very night Vince died. Also, about half of the Bodhi video is about how Vince was an abuser, though largely due to his mental health problems, and we get to see Vince trying to do better. But despite that large Walter video, it frustrates me the sheer number of people that don't talk about Walter being abusive. They say Walter is tough, and I mean at a certain point when you have Vince crying over memories of being abused when he is 54 years old and supposed to be celebrating his son's first day of training, I don't think it's a question of if Walter was abusive. I think it's a fact. Likewise, when you have someone in the living room arguing with their parent with dementia about the importance of not stealing people's cars, only for them to give in and say, "No, I stole the car," to make the yelling stop, it's really hard to hear anyone pretend that the relationship between Vince and Walter isn't one where Walter is abusive and Vince is reacting, even when those reactions aren't great. But it's not just the fan base that doesn't see Walter as abusive. It's also the kids' generation. Bodhi, Eve, Jake, Audrey, Gabriella all miss that Walter is abusive. One could argue that we haven't seen much on-screen evidence of Walter being objectively abusive to Vince in front of Gabriella or Audrey, but they do see him yelling at Vince when they're walking through the engine bay in One Last Time. However, we do see Walter being abusive in front of Jake and Bodhi in ways that you would think that they would see what's happening, but they don't. Instead of listing out every single instance, because this is not Walter Leone Part 2, not yet anyway, I want to look at some very specific incidences, including the ones that I've talked about before. Those incidents include Vince and Bodhi's fight in Fare Thee Well, the living room scene in Death Trap, and the blowout in One Last Time. Now, before we go any further, I need to pull out one of my standard disclaimers for this one. 2 of these episodes, Fare Thee Well and Death Trap, were excluded from my Walter analysis because they include Walter having dementia. I'm not bringing up these instances for the purpose of saying, see, he's been in a dementia episode that proves he's an abuser. I'm bringing them up to highlight Bodhi's interpretation of Vince's behavior. The episode Fare Thee Well doesn't feature Walter, but the family plot is about Walter specifically asking Bodhi and Sharon not to tell Vince and Luke that he's being tested for dementia. While Sharon interprets this as Walter being sweet, Vince understandably interprets it as Walter trying to keep the upper hand over his sons. Vince expresses to Bodhi that he has always thought of his dad as someone scary, though this goes right over Bodhi's head, and then the two fight for the rest of the episode. Bodhi tells Vince that he doesn't want Walter to have dementia because it would make it wrong for Vince to hate his dad. It's actually Walter's dementia that spurs the next incident I want to talk about in the episode Death Trap. In that episode, Walter steals Sharon's car in a dementia episode, prompting a silver alert, but he makes it home safely. When Bodhi gets to his parents' house, he finds his parents and grandfather arguing about the car being stolen. As Walter continues to insist that he's innocent, because he's in a dementia episode, to stop the yelling, Vince confesses to taking the car. Walter is immediately like, "Why would you do that? What's wrong with you?" And Vince starts apologizing incessantly and takes his dad upstairs away from Bodhi. While I don't count this as an incident of intentional abuse, instead what I find interesting is what Bodhi says to Audrey about it. Sometimes ending arguments with "you're right" can be a way to deal with someone in a dementia episode. At the end of the episode, during his date with Audrey, though, Bodhi describes this behavior, Vince letting Walter yell at him until Vince apologizes for stealing the car, and Walter says he believes Vince is sorry, as Vince's best version, because he put away years of beef to take the blame to stop Walter from yelling at him. Yep, Bodhi heard his dad apologizing incessantly and being treated like the bad guy by Walter, and that's putting aside years of beef, apparently. This incident leads Vince and Sharon to decide Walter does need to go to a nursing home, and that's where we pick up in One Last Time. We see all four Leones who currently live in the States pack into Vince's truck, and Walter spends the entire drive attacking Vince, claiming Vince always wanted to do this. Bodhi defends his dad, but not for long. When they have to go to the station due to there being severe weather, Walter yells at Vince in front of his employees that he's not a big shot. Vince shoots back that Walter hasn't been a big shot for a long time, and Bodhi defends his grandfather. During the blowout, Walter screams in Vince's face, and Vince is nearly reduced to tears. When Walter is walking away, Vince says, "I'll never forgive you either," which makes Walter threaten to beat Vince up. Then something interesting happens. Bodhi restrains Walter, and once Vince is out of the room, Bodhi reassures Walter that they're all heartbroken over doing this. At the end of the episode, Bodhi seemingly helps with making plans for Walter's return to the Leone house, but upon hearing that his son has bowed to Walter's decision-making, Walter says, "You know what, I'll go to the nursing home." So what I hope you saw across these three examples, even in the absence of me talking about Walter's abuse directly, is that Vince is constantly having trauma responses to his dad. Bodhi is witnessing those responses, but interpreting them as dad and grandpa have beef, not that Walter is being actively abusive. In addition, he seems to interpret Vince's bowing down to Walter in both Death Trap and One Last Time as Vince being the better person instead of Vince being an abuse victim. This, right here, is the exact pattern that I see in Hell of a Boss. Like I said, as far as I can tell, on TV tropes, this trope is just an inversion of another trope. The trope itself is about something not being abusive, but people accidentally thinking it is. Like people being convinced that a normal injury was caused by being pushed down. Therefore, the inversion is something that is clearly abusive taking place before our eyes, but the character just completely misses it. What I find interesting with Hell of a Boss is that while Walter's more egregious examples of abuse towards Vince happen when Bodhi isn't there, Via is oftentimes right there. If you didn't know, there's a whole lot less of Hell of a Boss than there is with Fire Country, with there only being 20 total episodes of Hell of a Boss. Plus a bunch of shorts, but I think Stolas is only in like 1 or 2 of them. Well, I guess there's 21 episodes if you count Mission Zero, but we see the same pattern that we saw in Fire Country and Hell of a Boss. So maybe I guess the best way to do this is to talk about the abuse and then Via's reaction as we see it happening right there. Chronologically, the actual first glimpse we get of Stella's treatment of Stolas comes in the circus with the night that Blitz breaks in to steal the book. Stella has decided to hold a still not divorced party to celebrate with all of her female friends about how their marriages hadn't fallen apart. We hear Stella mocking Stolas to her friends, specifically saying she's glad she's had Via because now she doesn't have to pretend to want to have sex with him, mocking Stolas for being bad in bed. Stolas responds to this by having a drink, and eventually security alerts him to Blitz's presence, and bad decisions are had by all. The next morning, when Blitz idiotically falls on the breakfast table, Stella starts screaming at Stolas, and he tears her banner saying that he wants a divorce. Back to the beginning of the series, in the episode Lululand, we see Stella throwing Stolas' things and yelling homophobic slurs while Stolas tries to greet Via for breakfast. However, she informs him that she is listening to a song called "My World is Burning Down Around Me" by Fuck You Dad. Then Stolas tries to make her feel better by going to a shitty theme park called Lululand, which she hates. While at the theme park, Via cries that Stolas is going to leave her to be with Blitz, just like her childhood nightmare. We find out in the middle of season 1 that someone has hired an assassin to murder Stolas, but since Stolas was pretty sure he was going to be murdered randomly at Lululand, no one really takes time to investigate who it was. As the show progresses into season 2, we see Stolas kick Stella out after she admits to staying in the house to torment him. She also tries to hit him, and the speed at which he catches her hand suggests something not good for that part of their marriage. Stella moves out on the exact day that Stolas had intended to take Via to a star show that he had promised many years ago. However, with Stella and Stolas arguing, Via, heartbroken because her dad said mom moving out is going to take all weekend, steals his book from immediate murder professionals and goes to the human world. Stolas immediately flies into a rage, screaming at Blitz and his employees for allowing her to take the book due to their apparently lax security protocols. The members of IMP head after her, but for complicated reasons, it ends up being Blitz's daughter Luna who finds her. Via cries that her father hates her mother more than he loves her, and while I definitely have a hard time believing Stella just happened to pull this stuff on an important father-daughter event day, from Via's perspective it seems like Stolas just wants to argue with Stella instead of keeping his promises. It's only a couple of episodes later the assassin is back, and we find out that Stella was the one who hired him. Blitz is off being a dad, and Moxie and Millie are off being professional instead of efficient, and Stolas very nearly does get murdered. However, Stella calls it off at the last minute, and Mox and Millie show up to take Stolas to the hospital. The assassin getting called off at the last minute still turns out to be pretty useful for Stella. She tells her brother that Blitz is being allowed to use the room more, and Andrelphus sets a trap for Stolas by claiming that Blitz manipulated Stolas sexually and stole the book. Stolas shows up to say, actually, this whole thing was my idea, so Blitz doesn't get executed. Satan says he can't execute Stolas and needs a new punishment. That's when Andrelphus reveals his marvelous plan that Andrelphus should be prince instead of Stolas, and Satan is like, yeah, sure, let's do that. Stolas is banished for 100 years, and Stella is given full custody of Octavia. And because the show is just an animated soap opera, Via happens to be watching all of this while her father was literally willing to die for his imp boyfriend. In my opinion, the shittiest of these things that Stella does, and our best look at how much Via blames Stolas, comes in the most recent episode, Mary Sinsmith, the season 2 finale. Stolas has finally recovered from what happened at the trial, and he tries to call Via. However, Stella takes her phone so that she can't talk to him, and then Via goes off in her room to sing a ballad about how much Stolas and Blitz suck. At some point during the montage, Octavia finds her dad's antidepressants, which she apparently didn't know he was taking. Very long story, and one fight scene later, Octavia uses the existence of the antidepressants as proof that Stolas didn't really love her, even though we see in flashbacks that Stolas was her primary caregiver at night when she had nightmares, as Stella refused to care for her. Via tells him that she doesn't want anything to do with him and storms out, with the knowledge that he can't do anything to contact her for the next 100 years. And that's where we are. At least that's where we are as of when I am recording this. Hell of a Boss Season 3 is coming out sometime in October, so we'll see how far this goes. I think it's interesting that Via sees so much and Bodhi so little. Bodhi isn't there when Vince is crying about memories of being physically abused, or most of the stuff that I talked about in my Walter video, and oftentimes that's the point. Walter is very intentionally putting on a show that he isn't abusive. He is often helped in that by Vince and Luke, who never tell Bodhi the truth, but one can kinda understand why Bodhi misses stuff. Via, though, sees so much. She sees the destruction of her dad's things. She sees her mom calling to interrupt what was supposed to be an important father-daughter day to cause family drama, and perhaps most importantly, it does seem like she saw her uncle sexually humiliating her dad in front of all of hell, and yet she comes away with the idea that her dad, and Blitz by association, is the problem. And that's what makes this trope so fascinating. We already have this trope that seems like it's not very well used or recognized in media, since it's not even its own trope. But what you have here is two different situations where you see the exact same behavior from two different characters on two different shows that exist in two completely different genres. But it comes back to the storytelling mechanism of what does it look like when a person sees abuse and doesn't recognize it for what it is. I know this video is all about explaining my Hotel Edgewater project, and this sharing of tropes is really the backbone of that. I'm not saying that Has Been Hotel and Fire Country are the exact same show. I'm saying that they play with the exact same themes with similar characters and similar relationships in two completely different playgrounds. I literally cannot imagine a world where Max Theriot watches the Helliverse, and I kind of feel this way about Viv being too busy to watch what looks like on the surface a standard firefighting procedural, and yet these two universes somehow cover the exact same themes. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and that you've been enjoying my Hotel Edgewater edits. Every time I send them to Mom or members of the Fire Country Book Club, they crack up, so I hope you are as well. Let me know if you want me to make more of these type of videos where I delve into how the two universes overlap themes, character archetypes, relationships, or tropes, because this was just an incredibly fun exercise. But if you are here because you are a Hell of a Boss fan, welcome. If you are here because you are a Fire Country fan, I hope you enjoyed my analysis of this adult comedy. But in 2 weeks, I'm going to have to do something less fun and more real world, and that's a really long defense of Gabriella. I've been wanting to do something like this for a really long time. I've literally had my notes on it for basically a year, but after so many months of seeing Gabriella be treated poorly on the Fire Country subreddit, I've decided that it's finally time to defend my favorite Olympian.